Come with us on a journey that will tell of the region's rich seafaring traditions. Archaeologists date the arrival of indigenous people to the Gulf Coast as far back as 8000 BCE. Prior to that, there were no humans. At this time, the first Native Americans journeyed from Asia across Alaska and ultimately to settle along Mississippi's southernmost shore. Here the people flourished, thanks to the region's temperate climate, fish-filled rivers, and fertile landscape. Long before the first European explorers set foot on the North American continent, tribes such as the Pascagoula and Biloxi, clans that were related to the Choctaw and Sioux people, had this land and water entirely to themselves. The area's first contact with Europeans came in the 1540s with Spanish conquistador Hernando de Soto. He passed just north of Mobile and through central Mississippi on his way from Florida to discover the Mississippi River. The Native Americans living along the coastline already had extensive trade networks. Surely they heard of his passing, but little did they know at the time how their lives would be changed. In 1699, the Gulf Coast's first European settlement was established by Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville, a French-Canadian ship captain, soldier, and explorer who was charged by King Louis XIV to find the mouth of the Mississippi River and then stake a claim on the entire territory for France. He built Fort Maurepas and the civilian community around it, known as Old Biloxi, along the shore of what is now Ocean Springs, Mississippi. There he left a garrison of 81 men before sailing back to France. D'Iberville left the building of the new French territory to his younger brother, Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville. He also left behind carpenters to build homes, fortifications, and boats for the arriving colonists. The coast was marsh. There was little in the way of land transportation. Boats were essential. In 1720, a contingent of 10 ship's carpenters, shipwrights, arrived from France to begin work at the Chaumont plantation on the Pascagoula River in Gautier. Bienville needed a bigger port and moved the new French capital, establishing Mobile in 1702, and then on to build New Orleans in 1718. Enterprising colonists soon followed Bienville's footsteps, forming settlements along the Mississippi shoreline. One example is the nearby La Pointe Krebs plantation in Pascagoula. Dating back to 1757, one of the outbuildings is one of the oldest surviving structures in the Mississippi Valley, an area that includes New Orleans. It is now preserved as a museum that is open to the public. Constructed on land granted to Joseph Simon de la Pointe, a French-Canadian officer in Bienville's fleet, the plantation initially produced indigo for dye and wax myrtle for candle making. Operations were later taken over by La Pointe's son-in-law, Hugo Krebs. Krebs is remembered for inventing a cotton gin decades before Eli Whitney. The building, now called the LPK House, is preserved as a Pascagoula museum and is open to the public. The adjacent cemetery is one of the oldest in the southern United States. The earliest tombstones even have French inscription. Coastal Mississippi was affected by its share of armed conflict throughout the 1700s and 1800s. There were also the Natchez and Choctaw uprisings, the Creek Wars, and the West Florida Revolt of 1810. There were plenty of smugglers and privateers, too. One of them was the most famous of the Gulf Coast pirates, Jean Lafitte. Lafitte conducted his activities along the waters and barrier islands off of the Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana coastlines, mostly against Spanish and English trading ships. However, he always remained faithful to his native land along the Louisiana-Mississippi coast and was there to help Andrew Jackson win the Battle of New Orleans. In fact, it was cannon from his ships that held the line against the much larger invading force of British in the War of 1812. The most devastating conflict of all, the American Civil War, further shaped the people and history of the region. Fortunately for this area, the Gulf Coast, unlike much of the South, was not dependent on the cotton and slave trades, and rebounded quickly after the Civil War. Within 10 years, its economy exceeded pre-war levels, thanks in large part to the thriving timber and sawmill industry. For the entire 1800s, the major industry was timber. Trees were cut, floated down the bayous and rivers to ports. Here, sawmills cut the timber into transportable size, and the lumber was then sent, usually on locally built ships, to the Caribbean and Western Europe. Those areas were already deforested and more than anxious to purchase Mississippi-grown lumber. In the aftermath of the Civil War, locally there was a rebound building boom, and it was all with wood. Two other activities made steady commercial progress: the seafood industry and shipbuilding. The building of ships was an industry built on economic necessity. For early coastal settlers, water was the only viable transportation and trading route to get commodities to market. The surrounding land was far too swampy with too many rivers and bayous for efficient land passage. It wasn't until about 1900 that coastal roads became reliable. Prior to that, travelers and land commerce had to loop northward above the marshes, rivers, and bayous to get to New Orleans and Mobile. The earliest recorded vessel built on the Mississippi Gulf Coast is the schooner Victory, built in 1806 by Charles Ely, a ship carpenter who lived on Choctaw Bayou, now called McInnis Bayou. The Victory was 38 feet long with an 11-foot beam. She made runs to the port of New Orleans carrying lime, shingles, tar, and lumber. The Governor Stone is a typical seafaring trading schooner from the height of the family-built shipyard era. Constructed in Pascagoula in 1877, it was christened in honor of a popular Mississippi governor. From the first shipwrights brought to the region by D'Iberville to the small family-operated shipyards along the Pascagoula River and Biloxi's Back Bay, these continued to grow throughout the 19th, 20th, and now 21st centuries. Shipbuilding has become the biggest industry in Jackson County. In 1829, the first steamboats arrived in the region. These shallow-bottom boats, propelled by steam, no longer required the wind on open water or men and animals pulling barges on the rivers. To the amazement of early boatmen, steamboats could sail in any direction, even upriver. Robert Fulton's design also included paddle wheels and could maneuver in the shallow water of the Mississippi Sound and local rivers. The cry, "Steamboat a-comin'," soon rang from every Mississippi coastal town as the twice-a-week steamboats made their run through Pascagoula, Ocean Springs, and Biloxi back and forth to Mobile and New Orleans, and from there on to the rest of the world. Along the Mississippi Gulf Coast, boat construction even included steamboats. The earliest local-built paddle-wheeler came from Pascagoula and was probably built at Beebe Point, where Chevron is now located. The Pearl River was 79 feet long, built in 1829, and remained in service on the Pearl River for many years. This golden era of the steamboat, along with the invention of the telegraph, heralded the beginning of a tourist industry along the Gulf Coast, which catered to travelers and seasonal visitors by building lavish beachfront hotels. Technology continued to move forward. In 1870, the railroad came to the Gulf Coast, good for tourism and commerce, but bad for the beautiful paddle wheelers. 2 years after the arrival of the railroad, the steamboat era came to an end. World War I propelled Mississippi's shipbuilding industry from relatively modest family-owned operations to company-owned shipyards, building large ocean-going vessels to meet the influx of government contracts. An example of a World War I wooden ship is the USS Pascagoula. She was a military cargo ship built in Pascagoula and completed in 1918, 1 month before the war ended. But with the end of the war came an end to large wooden ships. Steel vessels were becoming state-of-the-art. The industry fell into a post-war slump, but another side of maritime commerce was just gaining its own steam. Prohibition was in full swing, and rum runners, illegal smugglers of liquor, often rum from Jamaica, filled the economic gap. Cargo boats would pull up just outside the 12-mile territorial limit and transfer their goods to rum runners, fast boats that raced back to the mainland by cover of night. This activity was illegal, but it kept many small boat builders and repairers in business. Determined to put an end to the activity, the government established a United States Coast Guard station at the mouth of Pascagoula River. There it has remained a strong presence in Pascagoula ever since, although now it is based on nearby Singing River Island. By the late 1930s, ominous war clouds were again brewing on the horizon. Robert Ingalls Sr., a shipbuilder from Birmingham, Alabama, decided to establish a state-of-the-art facility in Pascagoula to capitalize on the anticipated flood of government contracts for military vessels. The Ingalls Shipyard was founded in 1938. This new facility employed two techniques that revolutionized the industry: electric arc welding and modular shipbuilding. With the introduction of welding, a single welder could do the work of a four-man riveting gang, not only more quickly, but also producing faster, more streamlined ships. And using modular building principles similar to those of Henry Ford's assembly line, vessels could be mass-produced more economically than ever before. In 1940, Ingalls launched the SS Exchequer, America's first all-welded steel ship. It immediately was appropriated by the U.S. Navy and rechristened as a seaplane tender. During the war years, Ingalls specialized in building C-3 cargo ships. Ingalls C-3 hulls were adapted to seemingly everything, including flat-top escort aircraft carriers that went to work for the British Navy. C-3s were the most high-tech of wartime transport ships, far exceeding the old Liberty ships. One of Ingalls' most accomplished ships was the USS Samuel P. Chase, an attack transport. She was Ingalls' most decorated World War II ship and served in all 5 European invasions, including D-Day. Throughout the war, the yard operated around the clock. With war pulling many men into combat, the burgeoning shipyard industry still required workers. The ladies stepped in to fill the void. It was the era of Rosie the Riveter. Ingalls' entry into that fray produced the nation's top female shipyard welder, Vera Anderson. She got to be feted at the White House in grateful appreciation of her role. The Cold War period, from 1946 until the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, was a time of nail-biting anxiety as the United States sparred with the Soviet Union for global dominance. Fortunately, there was never out-and-out conflict, but each side needed better weapon systems. Ingalls responded. During that era, Ingalls built 13 new submarines, 12 of which were nuclear-powered, the most sophisticated naval craft of that time. One of those, USS Parch, was a super-quiet spy submarine. Parch became the most decorated naval warship of all time for secretly tapping underwater Soviet communication cables. Other maritime-related endeavors round out East Mississippi's maritime industry. Halter Marine builds and repairs offshore oil rigs. Fletcher's Shipyard is a reminder of the quality work turned out by family-owned shipyards. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration National Marine Fisheries Service has its Gulf Coast office here and operates a fleet of oceanographic and fisheries research vessels. Omega Protein maintains an offshore fishing fleet to harvest menhaden, locally known as pogies, a source of fish oil used in many commercial products. For most coast citizens, the aspect of maritime industry that comes closest to their everyday life is what goes on the dinner plate in the evening. Since the earliest Native Americans waded in the shallow waters to collect oysters and used hand-braided nets to collect their fish, seafood has been a main staple. Flotillas of small boats go out every day in almost every kind of weather to bring us our greatly appreciated ration of fresh seafood. Both the Port of Pascagoula and the Port of Gulfport are vital economic drivers for the state of Mississippi and major employers for the Gulf Coast region. Pascagoula is ranked number 21 in the nation in receiving foreign imports. The Port of Gulfport is the third busiest deep-water container port on the Gulf and ranked number 64 in the nation in foreign imports. Chevron's Pascagoula refinery, which opened in 1963, has grown to be the company's largest U.S. refinery. It processes 330,000 barrels, or 13.9 million gallons, of crude oil per day. The unrefined product is brought in daily by smaller ships that shuttle between the refinery and the supertankers anchored well offshore. From the 1970s and beyond, Ingalls received the lion's share of some of the largest naval contracts ever awarded. Spruance-class destroyers, Ticonderoga-class Aegis-guided missile cruisers, and a variety of amphibious assault ships. LHAs, the largest flat-top aircraft carriers produced at Ingalls, are among the largest warships in the world, second in size only to the supercarriers in the U.S. Navy's fleet. Some recently built Ingalls ships are United States Coast Guard Cutter Monroe, designed for homeland security missions; guided missile cruiser USS Port Royal. Among other capabilities, this ship provides ballistic missile defense. Ingalls builds more classes of ships than any other shipyard in the United States. How much has Ingalls contributed to our nation's defense? Nearly 70% of our nation's current fleet of warships was built at Ingalls Shipyard. Whether 300 years ago or today, it's clear that the maritime industry, in all its varied facets, is deeply embedded in the spirit of the people of the Mississippi Gulf Coast. At the Mississippi Maritime Museum, our mission is to honor this past, preserve the present, and promote a thriving future. We believe that by illuminating the past, all of us can better understand today's challenges and gain greater insight about opportunities on the horizon.